Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It is Thursday, December 23rd, 2021. Once again, it is my great pleasure to be back with Professor Barry Simon. Barry, once again, thank you for joining me. It's great to be with you.
Great to be with you.
Barry, today we're going to focus finally on some post-2000 work. I'd like to start with a technical discussion. We've already talked about your transition or pivot to orthogonal polynomials. Tell me about your work specifically in spectral theory of orthogonal polynomials, and maybe we could just start with some definitions. What is spectral theory?
So it's actually a hard thing to define. In some sense, it goes back to the discovery of the spectral theorem by Hilbert at the start of the 20th century and its extension to the infinite dimensional case by von Neumann about 1927, which was in fact critical to quantum mechanics. And so the spectral theorem says if you're given what's called a self-adjoint operator, which is any observable in quantum mechanics, it has associated with it a set of certain so-called spectral measures. And it's the study of those measures and what they tell you about the underlying, if the observable happens to be the Hamiltonian, what they tell you about the dynamics. So the relation between dynamics as defined by an operator and these spectral measures is what's called spectral theory. But even if it's not dynamics, it's a way of you relating these spectral measures to the relation of them to various properties of the operators. So one of the most basic issues is, so if you're given the operator, you can construct the corresponding spectral measures, and in some cases there's a distinguished vector, so there's a single measure. So at least in some cases you sort of are given how do you go from the operator to the spectral measure. And there's an inverse problem, namely if you're given the measure, can you go back to the operator? In the context of one-dimensional quantum mechanics, this was actually studied by Gelfand and Levitan, famous paper about 1950, that physicists and mathematicians often use, because sometimes the spectral measure is completely described by giving scattering data and information on bound states. So the original Gelfand-Levitan is how do I go from scattering data plus bound state information to the potential. It's an absolutely beautiful piece of work. And they were motivated. They actually knew this was sort of a continuous analog. If you made space discrete, this was actually the question of, so if space was discrete, the corresponding differential operator became a difference operator, and difference operators corresponding spectral measures associated with orthogonal polynomials. And the issue of how you go from a spectral measure back to the underlying difference operator is solved by the theory of orthogonal polynomials. And Gelfand and Levitan said, oh, this is a continuous analog, and they were actually motivated by the theory of orthogonal polynomials. I can't resist, even though I don't will sound like I'm making fun of Mark Kant, but he was a great man. But somehow he didn't know the history, and about 20 years later, he went around claiming he discovered that the discrete analog of Gelfand and Levitan was the theory of orthogonal polynomials, somehow not realizing they'd been motivated by that. And, he had this great line, be wise, discretize. And I remember hearing this a couple of times. And one time, Peter Lax was in the audience, and I was next to Peter. And I said, Peter, I really don't understand this. This is what Gelfand and Levitan did. Peter looked at me and said, I know, but he's having so much fun. So there's this connection that I actually knew long before I started doing, quote, spectral theory. And in fact, my work that I may have referred to a couple of sessions ago on my own approach to inverse scattering was motivated by the fact that in the theory of orthogonal polynomials, I knew there was a different way, a continued fraction way of solving this inverse problem. And so that suggested to me there was another approach besides Gelfand-Levitan to doing the inverse problem. So I'd always sort of known there was this connection, but in fact, there are natural questions about asymptotics of orthogonal polynomials and classification of orthogonal polynomials. There was a huge community working in this area, and I was only vaguely aware it existed. About 1985, I visited University of Arizona in Phoenix, and there was a fellow there, a mathematician originally from Egypt, but had been in the US for many, many years, named Morat Ismail, who said, you really should look at orthogonal polynomials. I think it's close to what you do. And to my non-benefit, I didn't take him up on it then. And because of this sequence that I first got into the exotic spectral theory, the work I'd mentioned last time, I think, with Del Rio, and Killup had discovered that Navai, who was the two biggest guns in the theory of orthogonal polynomials, sort of has two different sides, one of which I named algebraic and analytic. Algebraic means really the study of special families. There are all sorts of interesting algebraic relations between them. This is sort of much of the classical subject. And the analytic is more trying to understand relations between these corresponding measures, which they didn't quite understand were spectral measures, but measures and the properties of the orthogonal polynomials. And there the big gun was a very interesting fellow named Paul Navai, who was Hungarian originally. I think he got his PhD in Moscow, but has spent most of his career at Ohio State. And I was sort of aware of them, but not very closely. But Killup had discovered a conjecture of Navai. It became clear when Killup and I were doing our work that this was intimately connected with exactly the set of problems that this orthogonal polynomial community had been working on. And in particular, when we proved the conjecture, as part of our work, we proved the conjecture of Navai. Actually, we proved it. We proved it up to a remaining fact. I had a postdoc named Hundenmark who was visiting. It was clear this basic fact was probably something he and I could work on, and we did this extra fact, and we proved Navai's conjecture. So I got in contact with Navai, and I still wasn't quite drawn into the subject as much as I also mentioned that Sergei Denisov had come as a postdoc, and he started lecturing on the theory of orthogonal polynomials in the unit circle. So I had realized there was a connection between Schrodinger operators and orthogonal polynomials in the unit on the real line, I'd never heard or understood this theory of orthogonal polynomials on the unit circle. And it clearly was very similar. There were similarities, but also interesting differences. And it became clear to me that the basic questions that the people, there was this whole community working on orthogonal polynomials, and the basic questions they were asking could be translated into questions in the spectral theory of the discrete analog of the Schrödinger equation. And this opened up the possibility that, well, maybe ideas that had been developed on one side, on the Schrödinger operator, the spectral theory side, if you will, could provide input into what the orthogonal polynomial people were interested in. But conversely, some of the ideas they developed might give new insights to the spectral theory side. And that's really what I focused on from about 2000. It's not that I didn't every once in a while go back and write some paper that was related to the early areas, but I really focused on this interrelation. And it meant that I was dealing with a very different community of people. It's true that as the years develop, you interact with different people, but there was sort of a continuous, it was a smooth evolution. The mathematical physicists, there was particularly those working on non-relativistic quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, and statistical mechanics. It was one big club, one big community, and the orthogonal polynomial community was a very different community. It was essentially, until I got involved, really no one working in both areas. And it's a very different community. It's a much friendlier mathematical physics community. I know one guy who worked in the area who got interested in probability, who said to me, it's amazing. The probabilists, they all support each other, and the mathematical physicists have a tendency to undercut each other or undercut each other's students. And there's some truth to that. And that has to do probably with personalities. But again, orthogonal polynomial, everyone gets on, everyone supports it's a very much more friendly community than the mathematical physics community was, at least in my time.
Barry, would you offer some conjecture as to why that is?
I think it maybe more than anything else has to do with certain personalities. It also may have to do, if the community is a little bit of a backwater, people tend to support each other. There isn't so much of this aggressive dog fights dog. If you look at theoretical physics, my impression is traditionally the high energy community are not particularly friendly to each other.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the condensed matter physicists tend to be much more supportive of each other. And I think this is again connected with the fact that when you're at the quote cutting edge or the place that's getting, people, and it draws aggressive people. I don't know exactly, but I really think more than anything else it has to do with the personalities of the leading figures.
Barry,
not me, of course. I'm always sweetness and light, but some of the other leading.
Barry, just to clarify, spectral theory of orthogonal polynomials, is that the theory of OP, or are there other competing theories?
No, it's not a competing theory. So it's really a set of tools to understand the issues that people in orthogonal polynomials are interested in. So really, it may be a misnomer to say the spectral theory of orthogonal polynomials. It's really spectral theory ideas applied to orthogonal polynomials. And it certainly is true that I was able to provide insight into a number of things that I still remember one issue that it just occurred to me that if you took the result that Avron and I had proven about boundary condition independence of the density of states in these almost periodic Schrodinger operators, and you translated that into this orthogonal polynomial language, you got an equality of two things that didn't look equal. And I remember, as an aside, at some conference, people were, that's an incredibly deep, difficult, and to me, the proof was trivial because you just carried it over. But it was the point of view that I was looking at it from a very different point of view that let me do all sorts of things that they hadn't been able to do. On the other hand, I also discovered they had some very interesting points involving potential theory ideas that turn out to be very useful. And there are people doing Schrodinger operators who, because of my writing on the subject, have gotten very interested in using these potential theory questions. And it's been a very fruitful clash of cultures, right? The Romans and the Britons come across each other, and it really is a clash of civilizations in some sense, and it can sometimes enrich both civilizations.
Barry, in reflecting on the differences between these two communities, so the mathematical physics community, where you're always straddling math and physics, as the name would suggest, in orthogonal polynomials, would that put you further into the math or the physics camp?
Well, that's an interesting question. So certainly orthogonal polynomials, they don't think of themselves as having anything much to do with physics. Although traditionally, many of the families of orthogonal polynomials that have been studied came out of physics. You look at the names of associated with them. There are several classes of famous classical orthogonal polynomials: Jacobi polynomials, Hermite polynomials, Laguerre polynomials, and each of them, Hermite they were all mathematicians, but they all also did important things in physics. So orthogonal polynomials often have a role in physics, and it's certainly true that there are questions in orthogonal polynomials that current people doing quantum computing need to know about, because it just comes up. These orthogonal polynomials come up. But certainly the people who do orthogonal polynomials are either members, or they're rather to join organizations of the AMS, certainly not the APS, or SCIAM. So there are, of course, lots of applications in other kinds of mathematics, and there are some people who would say some of the theory of orthogonal polynomials should be regarded as applied mathematics. And so the Society of Industrial and Applied Mathematics, SCIAM, actually has a section that is, I forget its exact name, but essentially is studying orthogonal polynomials and related ideas. Whereas, for example, the APS doesn't even have a section in mathematical physics. So they're mathematicians or applied mathematicians, and indeed I now am a member of SCIAM as well as the AMS and the APS.
By way of introduction of your interest in promoting his work, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Samuel Verblansky and his legacy.
Okay, so that wasn't promoting. That really, so it involves sort of, Killip and I had this lovely result that was an analog of a theorem so we had a result about orthogonal polynomials on the real line, and we realized it was really an analog of a result that Zago had proven when he was 19 years old, in fact. The paper was published when he was a lieutenant serving in the trenches of the First World War. A result on essentially orthogonal polynomials on the unit circle, although originally it didn't appear that way. It appeared in a totally different context. But Zago, a few years later, realized it really was a statement about orthogonal polynomials. And Zago's original idea, he only did it for measures that are called absolutely continuous. For the spectral theory ideas that I was interested in, this question I raised about mixed spectrum that we answered, and in fact are answered by the best version of Zago's theorem, involve extending it to allow so-called singular continuous pieces. And in much of the orthogonal polynomial community, if you asked people who first proved this, well, one of the answers would be Kolmogorov in the 40s. In fact, Kolmogorov only proved a special case. And some other people would say, well, it appeared in a book that Zago wrote in the 1950s, which was 35 years after. But that didn't seem right to me. And so I sent a message to Navai. Did he have any idea who first had proven Zago's theorem, essentially in the form that we had, in the most clear analog of what Philip and I had? And Navai didn't just write back to me. He wrote back to me CCing 20 people who I didn't realize at the time. This was my first exposure to these names, but these were all the leaders in the theory of orthogonal polynomials. Many of them are now buddies of mine, saying, it's an interesting question you raise. I have no idea. Maybe somebody else on this that I've copied does. And I got back a reply from a fellow named Leonid Golinsky, who's a very sweet guy. It turns out not only is he doing orthogonal polynomials, but his father before him also did orthogonal polynomials in this great Russian tradition. I say Russian, although they're based in the Ukraine, so they would probably be insulted if I was calling them Russians. And they're, in fact, Ukrainian Jews to boot. And Golinsky wrote back and said, I can't get a hold of the paper because it appears in a journal that isn't available to me. But I'd heard it might have appeared in, and he gave me a reference to a paper that I'd never heard of that was in one of the London Math Society journals. I can't quite remember whether it's Proceedings of the London Math Society or but one of the LMS journals by someone named Samuel Verblansky. And it was, in fact, the reference he gave, I think, was part 2, but so there were two, maybe it was part 1, but there were 2 papers that appeared in 1933. And as I read these papers, my mouth fell open, because not only had Verblansky written down was the first one to write it down in this form, But the paper had all sorts of ideas that, as this was at the time I was beginning to write my book on this, on orthogonal circle, that had been rediscovered. That somehow he'd never gotten credit for these papers. It's a little bit strange. I think I think to some extent the Russians may have consciously suppressed his work. There was clearly on some other work Verblansky had done some bad feeling with Krein and Kolmogorov, and so you could see there were a couple of Russian papers that did mention him, and then it was then they started only referring to the standard Russian expert on who had written papers. It was a very strange phenomenon. They didn't give him credit, and in the West, it wasn't clear. You know, I actually had my secretary, Sherry Galvez. I discovered in this book of Zago, where it was people had been saying this result first appeared, I actually found the reference to Verblansky's paper. And so I asked Sherry to see if she could figure out if this paper was ever referred to in the book. Now, these days, that would be very easy because a book like this is digitized. It has a reference number, and you just search on the reference number. But the book wasn't digitized in 2000. And so Sherry, being Sherry, just went through page by page, and she came back and said, no, it's not referred to. So it's a very, again, so it became clear that one of the things that I should be doing when I wrote this paper was give Verblansky some credit for what he'd done. And there were several very good opportunities for this, because the most basic coefficients that entered in the theory of orthogonal polynomials, the sort of analog of what are called the Jacobi parameters for the real line case, didn't have a single name. They had like 10 different names. And the most common name was reflection coefficients because of some crazy application of orthogonal polynomials to geophysical problems. And the problem was that from a different point of view, there was a natural, it was a terrible name. And so I gave the name Verblansky coefficients to these parameters, which I'd say now has stuck. And there's a result that, again, there were various results that had been attributed to other people that I decided I could just rename after Verblansky. And since my book has become the standard reference, I felt very good about doing this. He had passed away. He'd actually lived quite a long time. He passed away about 1996 or 7, so before I got in the field, but not so long before. And it's sort of interesting to take someone from the ashes of history and reintroduce them into the subject.
Barry, an overall question in your decision to transition or focus on orthogonal polynomials. Was this part of a larger trend?
This year's tidal wave of restrictive voting legislation will continue.
I know what happened.
In 2022, the Brennan Center adds this warning, quote, so far.
Did I trigger
my
Alexa?
Apologies. I tapped my hearing aid, and the hearing aids are connected. Anyhow.
Take 2.
It's terrible.
The question was, Barry,
but now I've lost I can't hear you.
Okay.
So let me try to fix that. Say something again.
How's that?
No, I don't have you. So somehow I've confused Zoom.
He's my old friend. I've come to talk with you again. Because of visions
It'll take a moment to get my system.
left in seeds while I was sleeping. And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone, neath the halo of a street lamp. I turned my collar to the cold and damp. When my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. And in the naked light,
Okay, I've gotten at least the number. Can you say something and I'll see if
How about now?
it works?
Well, I enjoyed some a cappella Simon and Garfunkel in the
I
intro.
apologize.
No, that's fine. All right, take 3. The question was just a broader question in terms of your own decision making and where the field was at that point. Your decision to transition into orthogonal polynomials. Was this part of a larger trend in mathematical physics among people in the field that you would consider peers? Or was this something where you were out on your own, essentially?
Well, depends on which part of the field you talk about. So there's no question that on the side that looks at almost periodic Schrodinger operators, non-relativistic quantum mechanics, I drag that part of the field into the subject. So now almost everyone, not quite everyone, but almost everyone who writes about that will immediately try to address the question, oh, I can do this for Schrodinger operators. What about orthogonal polynomials on the unit circle? So I really did drag that whole part of the field. On the other hand, the people who tended to focus on more traditional parts of non-relativistic quantum mechanics and higher in three dimensions or multi-particle quantum mechanics and statistical mechanics, they were not happy that I had moved into mainly doing one-dimensional stuff. You have to remember that by 1990, for a variety of reasons, I was mainly doing things in one-dimensional theory, because it wasn't that so much that I made a conscious decision as my research led me in along a given path. But it's quite clear that many of those people regard me as a traitor, and I left the field. And it is still true. I mean, right, my last NSF grant got turned down because for whatever reason, even though I was careful in the grant to say this is not a proposal in mathematical physics, it's a proposal in the theory of orthogonal polynomials, which there really is a whole group of people supported by the NSF. Somebody in the NSF said, oh, Barry Simon, threw him into mathematical physics. And one of the reviews gave me a fair, which is the middle ranking, and basically it's very hard to get a grant to get one, saying, oh, this is maybe an interesting grant, but it has nothing to do with mathematical physics. Of course it has nothing to do with mathematical physics. And I'm sure this is someone who felt it was terrible of me to leave the interesting parts of mathematics and start doing this crazy orthogonal polynomial stuff.
Perhaps the word traitor is extreme, but the notion that you left the field, is that a fair assessment of what you actually did?
Well, I pay attention to it, and I still write an occasional paper. I certainly wrote a number of papers in the subject, and the current main project I'm working on is a book on the statistical mechanics of lattice gases. That has nothing to do with really going back to things I did 40 years ago. On the other hand, it is certainly true that I focused primarily on subsets of what I did in the 70s. That's partly because, we discussed when I went to Caltech, I realized because of the array of colleagues I had, I would probably be narrowing my interests. So it's not so much that I, quote, left the field, but my interest did narrow.
Did this change the kinds of graduate students that you attracted?
Probably to some extent. In the 80s, I had a few graduate students who really were not very mathematical, although they obviously couldn't work with me without doing, but who wound up with jobs in physics departments. It's very hard for me to imagine that a graduate student I had after 2010 or after 2005 that would wind up in a math department. So even one guy who had started out as a graduate student in physics is now in the math department at Price. So in some sense, it affected it a little bit.
Barry, a general question as it relates to all the work you've done on editorial boards of various journals. So aside from the desire, obviously, to perform a service to the community, when is this work an asset to your own research insofar as it simply forces you to stay on top of the literature more than you might otherwise?
Well, first of all, if you look at all the editorial boards I'm on, it's a phony. So the one editorial board that I was on for 35 years was Communications in Mathematical Physics. I was a real editor. I handled 50 papers a year. I did a lot of work. Sherry did some of the bookkeeping, but it was a lot of effort and it was worthwhile. But all the other editorial boards, I only agree to be on the editorial board if it's understood that they're using my name and I don't have to do any work for it. And often I get approached. We're not going to ask you to do anything, but we'd like to put your name on the masthead. So the Journal of Spectral Theory, when it was being founded, I was consulted, and I'm still sort of one of the key advisors, people that the editor-in-chief, sort of a group of the editor-in-chief, the managing editor, and I that deal with many of the policy issues at the first level. And the founder of the journal said, this journal we want to have you and Elliot leave on the editorial board, but we don't want to ask you to do anything.
What then is the political value of those affiliations in terms of setting the trend for where the field is going, or even hiring decisions for faculty members?
I've never heard, well, again, I don't know. It may be that in some, certainly at Caltech, it's, people are on editorial boards because they're doing a service to the community. It is totally ignored in hiring decisions, in chairman's deciding whether someone deserves a raise. It's just something one does because you're doing a service to the community. Like refereeing, for many people, sometimes you referee something, you may learn and understand something you wouldn't have otherwise, and it can help your research. But it's mainly putting back in time, and it's the right thing to do because after all, somebody else is refereeing your papers.
In a similar vein, the 3 honorary degrees you've been awarded in 1999, Technion, the University of Wales in 2006, and in Munich, the Ludwig Maximilian University in 2014.
So let me just correct you. The people in Swansea would not be very happy to just be called the University of Wales.
Swansea, okay. University. Let the record stand. We're talking about University of Wales, Swansea. Why these 3 institutions and why at that time? Can you make these 3 seemingly random awards?
It's always so. What happens is, how are honorary degree recipients picked? There's some committee that either somebody's on or other faculty are asked for recommendations, and there's a decision that there's someone there pushing, usually on the faculty at that institution. So the first of those was the Technion. It's no coincidence. Yossi Avram, who calls me his Rebbe, right? Who not only was he my advisee, or I was his mentor, but one of his students and one of his grand students, I was the mentor. He and I did a lot of work together. He had the idea that he really wanted to push this. Now, that might not have been enough. The Technion is a big bureaucracy, but it happened. There was a quantum chemist who had done complex scaling, which we discussed earlier, who knew of my work, and he also Yossi knew this, and so he also came on board. And there was someone in electrical engineering who knew me, so there were people from 3 departments lobbying the committee that decided who got an honorary degree, and I got the honorary degree. And in Wales, it's a much smaller university. There is a fellow named Audrey Truman, who originally came to Princeton in the late 70s because Arthur Whiteman was there, but he learned a lot from me. He twisted my arm, so he decided he wanted to have the International Congress of Mathematical Physics in Swansea and twisted my arm, so I was chair of the scientific committee and he was the local organizing committee, and we worked together, and we actually spent some time there. And he decided to lobby for this. It's not actually an honorary degree. It's called an honorary fellowship. They have strange names for everything. My favorite story is that while I was there getting this honorary degree, he said, "Oh, I have to introduce you to the vice chancellor. He's the head of the university." And I said, "I don't understand. If the head of the university is the vice chancellor, who's the chancellor?" "Oh, that's Prince Charles, of course." And at Munich, again, there are people. Munich is a big center of mathematical physics, has been for a long time. I think the guy pushing hardest there was a fellow named Siedentop, who'd had spent several years as a postdoc at Caltech, did his most important work there, or the work that first got him attention. And there were other people on the faculty there who knew of me, and they helped push it. So it's always, you get honorary. It's the same thing is true. I'm a member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. That's because Walter Turing, who was a big power there, decided to push for it. You always have, these are always decisions that are made by local people, and you need someone who's decided that what they want to spend a fair amount of effort on is trying to get someone or other an honorary degree.
Do you have any insight as to why Caltech does not confer honorary degrees?
No, I mean, I know Feynman was terribly opposed, but I'm sure he was not involved enough. But if anyone ever asked him, should we do it, he would have said no. He turned down honorary degrees. There were famous stories. I, in fact, feel one of the things I feel he was very rude about is he really should have accepted Princeton's honorary degree because he owed it to Princeton. But there's a famous quote you can look up on the web about Dick Feynman and honorary degrees.
Okay.
A letter up where he turned down the first honorary degree he was offered was from Chicago, and that's a letter where he turned it down that you can find on the internet. So I don't think that's the factor. I just think somehow they never did it, and so you have to decide, if I haven't done it in the past, why should I do it?
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate for people like you who have received this. You really can't reciprocate on an institutional basis.
Oh, but again, I shouldn't insult the people who pushed my degrees, but there's no way, even if Caltech had on our degrees, that I could get them up. It's not, it's rarely, there's a pecking order in science. And usually what happens, it's people who are at good institutions, but who owe something to someone higher up the pecking order. And they're not doing this because they expect something in return. They're doing it because they feel they're paying you back for what they. So I'm sure all the people who worked to get me honorary degrees did it because they felt they owed me a debt of gratitude for what they got from me as when I was their teacher in some sense.
Barry, I asked you about different kinds of graduate students.
So it is. So, for example, if there were honorary degrees, I might have pushed to get my advisor off of Whiteman an honorary degree.
Right.
That's the analog thing.
Yeah. I asked you about, in this transition, the past 20 years, different kinds of graduate students who might have been attracted to work with you. What about your collaborators? All that you've written in the past 20 years. Have you had different kinds of collaborators or different people that you've kept on working with over and over again?
Oh, there's certainly people I've worked with over and over again. I mean, as you may know, if you look at the web, I think I have at this point 115 co-authors. But of those 115, most are fewer than 3 or 4 papers, but I certainly have people who I've collaborated with many, many times. I still remember the day so my most frequent collaborator is Fritz Gastesi. I think my second and third are Elliot Lieb and Yossi Brown. And I still remember the day that we submitted the paper that put Fritz ahead of Elliot Lieb. And he walked into my office all excited that he'd finally done it. So, I have some that but that tends to vary. So Elliot and I wrote a lot of papers when we were both at Princeton. We actually have done very little since he left Princeton. Fritz he got more responsibility, so he couldn't visit Caltech as often. He didn't quite shift as thoroughly into orthogonal polynomials as I did, although so we sort of stopped doing things together. What happens is many of my collaborators, we collaborate because they would come and visit me for a month or two, but that's harder to do as you get more responsibilities. And, for the last 15 years, I have a series of, at this point, it's over 10. I'd have to count up how many, with 2 people who were postdocs around 2002 or 3. And we have a paper that we just submitted last week. So we continued, and they, pre-COVID, they would come to Caltech for 2 weeks and we would work hard together. Zoom actually is not bad for working.
Yeah.
So we've continued to do some stuff.
Barry, in 2009, were you more happy or more grudging to become executive officer again?
So, in many ways, I had been acting. I mean, a lot of some fraction of issues with the department, I was being asked to do that because the division chair didn't trust or like the executive officer. And so there wasn't another obvious candidate. Actually, there was an obvious candidate, Ramakrishnan, but he didn't want it. And I said, fine, I'll do it. And he followed me. So it was grudging.
Second time around, did you have an easier time of it?
I probably did, but I think that's because there were harder issues dealing. The first time around was harder, but not because I didn't have the experience, but there were various issues. Tom Wolfe's death. Tom Wolfe was, I think, 48 when he was killed in an automobile accident. It was really very traumatic. And it was a very tough time, but that didn't have to do with what I did or didn't have experience. It was what happened then. We happened to have a lot of retirements, so there were a number of factors, and that was also the period when the new curriculum came in, which increased the load of the division of the EO for various reasons. So it was an easier time the second time around, but it was not because I knew the ropes. It was really there just weren't as bad issues to deal with.
What was the impact on math in the new curriculum regime?
Well, we had to figure out how to handle the new advanced placement exams. So dealing with advanced placement, I remember we found a very good solution in the end, but we found a very good person to do it. But there was beginning to be a big push to accept students who had somewhat weaker backgrounds because they came from weaker schools. They were usually very smart, but they weren't up to the same speed as and so we essentially had a math camp, as it were, the summer before, and just figuring out who was going to do that. We actually found someone very good who, even though he left Caltech, to come back for the summer. So there were things like that just took time to set up and arrange that were, in my mind at least, connected with the change to the new curriculum. Although it is also true that there were some things that were easier because I knew the ropes. I sort of knew. Beginning of every year, I have to meet with the new postdocs and explain to them the rules of the road, as it were. And, I knew what issues. So it is true that I did, to some extent, know the ropes, and that helped.
Barry, now that I'm alerted to the distinction in your CV between real work versus honorary work with the editorial boards, your work for the IAMP on the executive committee and then as vice president, was that real work? Was that a real commitment on your part?
Well, yes and no. So it's really true that that's an organization that first of all, it's not like it's not like, say, the AMS, which being the president of the AMS is a big deal. Even being the president of IAMP, the IAMP every 3 years has a 3 years has an international congress, and basically you're organizing that conference and worrying about a few prize committees. It's not a terribly onerous job. It's also true that I had my arm twisted to be president in the early 80s, and I was just trying to set things up at Caltech, and I said, no, I just don't have the time, and I convinced someone else to take the job. Because it seemed like a little more work. Being on the executive committee, you get input, but it's basically just a few email exchanges. It's not like being the editor of CMP. Every week you're worrying about something. These other things, every once in a while, something comes up. It's not
Barry, we've reached the point in the narrative, we talked about this last time, where you have a number of prizes that are clustered together, and you gave a cute scientific concept behind that. So in 2012, it's the Henri Poincaré Prize, 2015, the Bolyai Prize, 2016, the Steele Prize, 2018, the Danny Heinemann Prize. So just to orient people who might not be familiar with these communities, is there one that's far and away more prestigious than the others?
Well, maybe the Steele Prize, because the Heinemann and Poincaré are prizes in mathematical physics. It's a relatively limited community of people. So I think people assumed that when it was my turn, as it were, in terms of so the Poincaré Prize was only started around just before 2000, is my memory. And so there's a huge backlog of more senior people than me, like Arthur Whiteman. And it was clear my generation would come up around when I got the Poincaré Prize. Actually, Jörg Fröhlich, who's also in my generation, got the Poincaré Prize the time before. But it was I think people would have been surprised if I hadn't gotten it that year. And the Heinemann Prize is a little bit broader because the Poincaré Prize really has been given to someone in the kind of mathematical physics that I do. The mathematical physics that is the Heinemann Prize has sort of varied. About half have been to theorem provers, but about half have been people like Murray Gell-Mann and Murph Goldberger, who are theoretical physicists that are somewhat mathematical, but wouldn't call themselves mathematical physicists, and we wouldn't call them mathematical physicists. So it's therefore a slightly but again, I don't think anyone was surprised that I got it. In fact, one previous winner wrote to me and said, "I'm really pleased to see you got it, but I was surprised. I can't believe you didn't get it years ago." So those two prizes, but the Steele Prize is essentially can be given to any American mathematician. The one for lifetime achievement.
Yeah.
And so it's a bigger deal in some sense.
As a matter of intellectual genealogy, Poincaré, Bolyai, Steele, Danny Heinemann, do you see yourself as part of any particular tradition for any of the awards?
Steele and Heinemann are people who gave money to set up the prize, so they don't have a tradition. Bolyai is, of course, that's a very different tradition. Bolyai was a Hungarian mathematician. It has a very interesting history. So the Bolyai Prize was named after this relatively obscure Hungarian mathematician, one of the inventors of non-Euclidean geometry, about the 1820s. And the Hungarian mathematical community around 1900 decided they wanted to set a prize up that was supposed to be the analog of for mathematics of the Nobel Prize. Now, of course, they didn't have the same amount of money as Mr. Nobel, so it didn't have the prestige for that reason. But the first two went, in fact, to Poincaré and Hilbert. And then the Second World War came, because they only give like every 5 years. And they stopped giving it. And it just totally died away and was reinvented after Hungary broke off from the Soviet Union about 2000. And it was decided, well, they were not going to be a Nobel Prize. They were going to give it for a book that had real impact on research. But the book had to be written in the past, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 8 years, but there was some, and there, sorry. I actually hadn't figured it. Never mind. I'm not going to try to explain. And there again, there was someone, a Hungarian orthogonal polynomial person, who decided that a Hungarian who decided that in orthogonal polynomials, who really thought my books on orthogonal polynomials in the unit circle were exactly the kind of thing they should be honoring. But he was chair of the committee, and he felt he couldn't properly push. So in 2000, 5 years before I got it, I don't remember what year I got it, he decided he couldn't really push effectively. It was nominated, but he then just made a point of not being the chair, but being on the committee the next time. So he felt he could more effectively push for it. And it's clearly his doing entirely that I have that prize. And it doesn't, it's a nice honor. The Hungarians were very nice, but it's a relatively less prestigious prize than these other ones.
Barry, when you were a Simons Foundation Fellow in 2013, what did that allow you to do? And I'm curious if you had any interaction with Jim Simons as a result.
Zero. This is the foundation. It has nothing to do with Jim Simons. It was 2013. Yeah, that sounds about right. So that was entirely, I think I may have mentioned that I had thought I'd arranged that I was going to have a full year's leave. The last year, last year that I was expecting to teach. So that, as I may have explained, that Caltech has this arrangement where you get, by agreeing to retire, you get 2 years pay without having to do anything. And I thought I was going to arrange 3 years because as part of taking the second term as EO, I got a promise of a full year sabbatical instead of and so I was expecting in the year, it must have been 2013-14, that I was going to have a full year's paid leave from Caltech. And when the division chair and I were working on it, the provost, again, Caltech, I can't imagine any other institution in the world where the provost gets involved in this sort of minutia with individual. But the provost said, well, no, the rules are if you go on a sabbatical, so the basic rule is there, if you go on a sabbatical, you have to come back to Caltech because they don't want you to go on sabbatical, get stolen, and you've tried out some other institution on Caltech's dime. Many institutions have that. I remember when we stole someone from Berkeley that we actually retroactively, he had been here on sabbatical, but in order to steal him, we had to pay Berkeley for his. So Caltech has that in place. That's the purpose of the rule. But the provost decided the rule was if I was going on scholarly leave, that wasn't really coming back to Caltech. And so I could not have a sabbatical without essentially coming back and teaching for as long as the sabbatical was on. Well, Caltech has 3 quarters. I wanted 3 quarters leave. No, he wouldn't give me 2 quarters. He could give me 1 quarter, but I'd have to come back and teach at least 1 quarter. So then I had the idea, since there was Simon's money, suppose Simon's would pay my salary for 1 of the quarters. Could I get 2 quarters off and then come back and do that last? So and I had to negotiate with the Simons Foundation because officially the Simons Foundation is half support for half the year where the institution pays for half the year. But this was 2/3 of a year. Anyhow, they agreed to that. But the only people I dealt with were the people who ran the foundation. I did not deal with anyone. And I certainly had no interaction with Jim. And I don't think I've had any interaction with Jim since the party I mentioned earlier.
Barry, one of the more fun-sounding awards, Jew in the City Orthodox All-Stars. So first tell me, what is that organization, Jew in the City?
Okay, it's actually a very interesting, I'd never heard of it until I got this award. So it's essentially a small organization run by a woman named Allison Josephs, who's a Balas Tshuva. That is, she didn't grow up. She grew up in a conservative household, but became really religious. And she became convinced that there really was a need for an organization because of various people she talked to, and particularly potentially people who become Balei Tshuva, who really realized that that there wasn't a conflict between the secular world and being religious, that you could do it in both at the same time. And she's since branched out. It's actually a pretty big operation at this point. It also, they particularly focus on people who, for one reason or another, have gone off the derrick, as they say, who had been religious, but because of some bad experience, sometimes it's in fact sexual abuse by teachers, it's all sorts of factors, and who are thinking maybe they want to come back. And so it's a very interesting and I think worthwhile organization, which she runs. Essentially, it's a full-time. And that has staff, and so they have to fundraise. And she decided at some point, both in terms of demonstrating, and she invented the name. This was at the point that Sex and the City was the big show. She called it Jew in the City after Sex and the City. And she decided to have these Jewish Orthodox all-stars, people who had somehow made it in the secular world. And, there were some obvious, like Joe Lieberman was an early Orthodox Jewish all-star. I think I was the third class, maybe it was the second. And I'm not sure where she got my name. It just came out of the blue. But when I got the offer, I asked Rabbi Edelstein if he'd ever heard of them, and he did a little looking into it and said you should accept it. And it was a very interesting group. So I was one of 7 all-stars. It was a very mixed bag. I remember if there may have been one other academic who couldn't come for various reasons. I think it was an Israeli. But one, for example, so one of the things they did is they have a very slick operation. There were 3 of us from the LA area, so she came out and did a video interviewing us. In fact, if you look at the videos online, they're kind of fun. One was a guy who, in fact, is in a Disney operation, is a cartoonist. And one is, in fact, she lives, I think, less than a block from me, although we didn't realize that till. So she's the daughter of a big shot in the fashion world, who's Jewish, I think Iranian originally, but not particularly observant. And she became observant, and he gave her own fashion line. So she was a big shot in the fashion world. And so she was also a Jewish all-star. And there was a reception that was actually at her father's house in Beverly Hills, the fanciest house I've ever been in.
And this is a reception that you could eat at.
Correct, because you bet. And of course, there was a thing in New York that was, and it's for them, it's a big fundraiser. They use it as a big fundraising device, and it's a fine organization. They still, in fact, they just put out a video that because it actually, I don't know what arrangement the Maccabees, which is a famous scene.
Yeah, sure. My kids love them.
Did it for them, did The Sound of Silence.
Ah, okay.
And the 2 themes are that The Sound of Silence is turning off your cell phones for Shabbos.
Yeah.
And so they have this great video. And in fact, I tend to put a Shabbat Shalom greeting for my Facebook friends. And tomorrow I'm going to put up a Jew in the City.
There you go.
It's an interesting organization.
Barry, more broadly, are you happy to play along? I know you don't have time to do Kiruv on your own, but are you happy to play along when various Jewish organizations or even individuals want to interact with you or promote you as, the famous yarmulke-wearing math and physics professor, in the sense that that's good PR for Frumkeit?
Okay, so there are 2 different things. One is I rarely get that kind of request. If I get that kind of request and I don't think they're going to abuse it in some way, I'm delighted to. But more often, I get a message that, to be unkind, I had this crackpot idea about why the Torah explains string theory.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? I rarely totally ignore emails I get. They're obviously phishing emails. These are emails I just, so I get a lot more of those than I get of, here's this guy who wears a yarmulke and shows you can still have them.
The 2015 textbook, how did that come about for the American Mathematical Society?
So
this is a comprehensive course in analysis.
Right. So one of the things, Caltech has always had, since I've been at Caltech, a graduate course in analysis. And I taught it fairly often. So most of my teaching has either been topics courses that are very specialized in my research, or in fact, that course. Not that I haven't done other things. When I wrote the book on group representations, I taught a course on group representation, but that was much of the teaching I did. And so I had a lot of experience with the textbooks, and I wasn't thrilled with them. And so I decided I'd write my own. And it very naturally, so the first term does real analysis. Second term does complex analysis. That actually turned into 2 volumes. And the third sort of has 5 weeks of harmonic analysis and 5 weeks of operator theory. And so that naturally led to what was originally supposed to be a 4-volume, but one of them was so big that Sergei Gelfand, who's the publisher at the AMS, that's the son of the most famous Gelfand, very interesting guy, insisted that it get broken in 2. So that's why I think of it as it's 4 parts, but 5 volumes. And as I was writing it, I realized that it would be very natural to put in other things. I actually used it as a way of learning certain things that I had really I'd never really understood much about wavelets. That's a chapter that wound up in it. So I did bonus stuff, and I polished it. And I actually approached 3 publishers. One of them was Springer. That was where the guy I dealt with, I couldn't believe it. I was concerned that Springer at that point, a lot of their book sales, it's still true, is not sales. They make a deal with universities. So Caltech gets it because it's some California consortium, but we have access to all advanced Springer math textbooks. So therefore, you don't get individual royalties. And so they have some arrangement. So I raised this issue with him, and his response was, well, your book isn't really for the academic world, it's for the business world, isn't it? So I realized this guy didn't know what he was talking about. But then I got wooed very hard by Cambridge, that I've been on the board. I know the editor really well, and Gelfand from the AMS, and eventually I signed with the AMS. And, the one disappointment is I knew it wasn't going to sell that well because, of course, book piracy is such an issue these days. I still remember at my 70s, so there's a picture I can probably send you if you want to see it, of the 2 editors that I dealt with, who I had published a number of my books between them. At my 70th birthday conference, there was a small exposition area, and they were exhibiting their books, and they're sitting there. And at that time, I was talking to Gelfand, and my book had been out for 6 months, these books, and I said, I'm sure they're already on the pirate sites. And he said, no, they can't be. It'll be another year and a half. Well, one of my former graduate students was standing by, and he shows me on his iPad, the books are already on the pirate sites. So it isn't that they've done badly, terribly badly, but I would have expected them to do really well, and they haven't sold that much. I would have expected them eventually to sell as much as we signed, but it's going to be a small fraction. And I still regard them as my magnum opus. I really worked hard on them.
Barry, another fun award, maybe one that's particularly meaningful to you. The James Madison High School Wall of Distinction in 2016. Now, how far back does the Wall of Distinction go? Were you aware of it? Did it exist when you were there?
I don't think it existed when I was there. I'm not aware. I don't have any idea how aware current students are, although the principal was at the awards ceremony. It's mainly the Alumni Association, which I don't think existed very much, but there are a couple of really big boosters. My brother had been somewhat active, so I only learned about it because he learned about it, and he started pushing them to see if. And it's also a very, very interesting. Had a different Disney guy. Was my year had a different Disney guy, who was the guy who had invented the Shrek character. There were again 6 or 7 people. It was a more interesting, in some ways, it was a more interesting group than, and it's because my high school is really impressive set of alumni.
I mean, it's an amazing who's who of alumni on that Wall of Distinction.
I mean, I was aware of the fact before this that there was a period in time when there were 3 Madison alumni at the same time in the U.S. Senate from 3 different parties.
Let's see. Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders.
Democrat.
Yeah.
Norm Coleman, who was a Republican from Minnesota.
Right.
And Bernie Sanders, who's an independent.
Yeah. That's amazing.
And Ruth Bader Ginsburg is an alumnus. And 5 Nobel laureates from Madison.
Amazing.
But there must have been some amazing teacher in the late 30s, because all our Nobel laureates, while their Nobel Prizes were spread like from about 1950 to 2010 or something, all the students were students in Madison between like 1930. They graduated between 1938 and 1945 or something. So it's not there haven't been any recent Madison graduates who got the Nobel. Although we got the oldest Nobel Prize winner in physics, this Madison alumnus, 95.
Yeah. Barry, your 75th birthday celebration, was that during the pandemic? Did that take place over Zoom?
Yes, it was just over Zoom, and it was a 3-hour Zoom session.
Why the decision to focus on Daniel Wells?
I didn't focus on it. Basically, they convinced me. I did not speak, but I got my arm twisted to speak. I wanted to speak about something that other people hadn't heard about, and I've been working on this statistical mechanics book, and there was this rather remarkable piece of work that it actually was a PhD thesis that never appeared in print because presumably the guy gave up. I'd love to make contact with him. He's still alive. He has a book on Amazon, in fact, not a math book, but I have no idea how to come. It's a self-published book. It's not really an Amazon. I suspect it sells very little, but you can easily convince Amazon to let you sell a book. And I have no way of making contact. And it's a lovely piece of work that somehow got lost, and it's actually going to turn. I have to write something for a book of articles in honor of Elliot Leap's 90th birthday. And I decided I'm going to write that up for that too. Some of it will appear in the book. The only disappointment I have is, there are 2 extensions, one of which I was able to work out, and it was mentioned in the talk, and the other is a conjecture that I am 100% sure is true. It's one of these things that I can check it for reasonable values in Mathematica, so I know it's true. And I've done some work and not succeeded. I've tried to get lots of my buddies to work on it too, and no one succeeded in solving it. It's all put as an open problem.
There's a reference in the slides, a book in process for Cambridge Press, Phase Transitions in the Theory of Lattice Gases.
Yes, that's the book I'm talking about.
Yeah. How far along is that?
So, it's hard to tell. So, right, the book, I had thought the book I told them originally about 350 pages. I now suspect it'll be more like 600. It's maybe at about 250 pages now. But to be honest with you, I put it aside for a while because there were some issues I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. One of the things that when you write a book where you're trying to explain things to others, you realize somebody has not done a very good job of explaining what they've done. And so I put it aside. I actually just went back to it yesterday. So I'm feeling like I have a head of steam. I don't know. It might take it in terms of, it's probably about halfway done. It's my guess. I would have said 2 years. It's probably going to be more like 3.5. I've been working on it for about a year and a half, 2 years. So it's about half done.
Barry, the year before, when you were inducted into the National Academy of Sciences, as you say the phrase, as he said immodestly, I wonder at this late stage, given how you've been recognized elsewhere, if one of your reactions was, what took you so long?
Well, it wasn't just my reaction, because for years I was aware, and I actually was aware. I understand a lot more about the process, having now been in the academy, and the election process is rather chaotic. And I heard a story that there was a group of people who were trying to push it. It's a very funny process. And it also is true that, 50 years ago, there used to be 5 or 6 or 7 mathematicians elected each year. And for whatever reason, until relatively recently, it went down to more like 3. And, I had friends, Percy Dyke was in the academy. He was aware that I was wondering, and we would talk occasionally. My impression was nobody really understood why that happened. And I know one guy was pushing hard. Who knows? It's a funny process. But yeah, I'm not the only one who won.
Must have felt good, though, when it finally happened.
Absolutely. So I'm very aware of when they were going to be announced, and that, it didn't happen this year again. And then one year I got the phone call.
And is your sense, is the recognition weighted at all in terms of, for somebody like you, the mathematical contributions and the physics contributions?
No, if anything, my impression is that while you could have a joint appointment, you can have people jointly elected. It's not very usual, and even sometimes. So, for example, there was a candidate that I nominated who's currently in the system, who I think will get elected this year. And there was a period when I was told that there's an applied math section, and the applied math section is not really quite applied mathematics. It's actually a lot of pure, for example, it's got a lot of probabilists in it who I would regard as pure mathematicians. And I was told that this candidate was being considered jointly, and the most recent thing I was told by the head of the math section is that he had talked to the head of the applied math section. The head of the applied math section had said, oh, this candidate is sure to get elected this year in our section. And the head of the math section said, well, it's going to be borderline. So they made a decision that that this candidate is not even being considered in the math section this year. And I think this candidate will get elected in the applied math section. It's a crazy system, but being in mathematical physics, my impression is there are some pure mathematicians who, the problem is all the people in the math section are asked to vote on all mathematics candidates. And you haven't heard of most of them. So you're trying to figure out, and there are some number of people who just assume, well, mathematics is not real mathematics. And so I'm sure that hurt me. I had no idea. It's a funny process. I used to think that there must have been some enemy behind, but it's just a chaotic process. It's a strange process.
Barry, one award that remains out there, perhaps to be had, perhaps not, of course, is the Fields Medal. I wonder if you could talk about the significance of the Fields Medal and what the track record of mathematical physicists have been in getting the Fields Medal.
Okay, so of course, there are two. There's the Fields Medal, but the other thing, the Fields Medal is obviously it's not something that I'm ever going to get because it's never been given. The Fields Medal it's bizarre. It has an age, even though it's not an official limit, it's not written down anywhere, it has an age limit of 40. And the first time within recent memory, I don't know what happened 50 years ago, when it became clear that this thing might not be such a clever limitation was when Wiles proved the Fermat theorem. And he was 43. And, people ask my opinion, and my opinion was it's not an absolute requirement. It's silly to make it. They should give Wiles the Fields Medal. They didn't. They gave him a special prize. And frankly, if I were Wiles, I would have said, go away.
Yeah.
But he was a gentleman and he took it. Then it was even worse with Oded Schramm. In his case, my memory is that somebody had to decide. So there was now they had this tradition, the tradition was now firm because we couldn't do it for the Fermat theorem. You clearly can't make an exception. So the question is, what does age 40 mean? And somebody made the absolutely ridiculous decision that you have to be 40 before January 1st of the year in which the Fields Medals are given. And Oded Schramm was 40 in January of that year. So he was, anyhow, it was something where he certainly should have gotten it, and they should have said, yeah, he's 40, but they didn't. And and in the end, they then, because the work he'd done was so important, and I'm not trying to belittle his collaborator, but on some of the later, he was the innovator, and on some of the later work, he did a piece of work with two collaborators. One of the collaborators was under 40 at the next Congress, and he got a prize for this. So the Fields Medal's a little weird because of that. The, of course, big prize is the Abel Prize. Now, in fact, there's been one Abel Prize to a mathematical physicist, to Yasha Sinai, who's also a probabilist. Fields medalist, it's a question of what you mean by mathematical physics. There have been people who work in parts of analysis that have an overlap with mathematical physics. So, for example, I'm having senior moments and not remembering names, but there's a flashy French mathematician who went into politics, who really did wonderful work that has some overlap with physics. He's not what one would call a mathematical physicist. On the other hand, he was actually the chair of the Poincaré Prize committee the year I got the Poincaré Prize. So he has some overlap with mathematics. So there are probably two Fields medalists who have overlap, but sort of members of the club, as it were. The only, quote, mathematical physicist who got no members of the club, although there is a Heinemann Prize winner who got the Fields medal, that's a Witten, who I still remember one topologist I know was scandalized when Witten got the Fields medal. And then Zyberg Witten, 4 years later, came out and was this absolutely incredibly important work in mathematics. And the topologists said, see, he finally warranted getting the Fields medal.
Barry, this rule that the Fields medal needs to be given to somebody under 40, it just makes me reflect. I can't help but note there's the rabbinic stipulation or decree that one should not study Kabbalah until after age 40.
Correct. Right. And by the way, if you look at the Abel Prize, every Abel Prize winner, with one exception, has been over 70. So the Abel Prize is given. It's an interesting. I think the median age is 78 or something. The one exception, by the way, was 65, and that was Andrew Wiles for the Fermat.
So Barry, you're uniquely positioned to comment on this, the notion of doing one's best work as a young person in math and doing one's best Torah learning later in life.
I can certainly say that it is an empirical fact. It's not so easy to explain that almost all people, mathematicians, do their best work under age 40. It's a handful of exceptions.
What do you think that's about? The plasticity of the mind? Energy? Daring? What is it? In the way that, for example, in Torah learning, there's a building of knowledge that you can add to.
So I would think that what happens in mathematics is this building is not as important as a freshness of viewpoint. It's that huge breakthroughs, and that's what people think of, not that are most often done by people who haven't been thinking about, who are new and have some fresh insight. But it is still a surprising fact to me. And as I said, I know of some exceptions of people who are I can even think of someone who's almost 50 when they did their best work.
In looking over your career, do you think this applies to you as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not even close. I mean, if I take so I was 40 in 1986. And talk about my 5 most important, or even my 10 most important things, probably 8 of them were before then. the top 5, probably 5 were before then, maybe 4, depending on where, it's ranking. It's not so easy. It's certainly true for me.
As you look at other mathematicians, does anybody buck that trend? Has anybody done their best work after?
Well, I said, I have a student who, Percy Dave, certainly did his most important work. I think it was when he was 48.
That's still pretty close to 40, though.
No, it isn't. If you think about the fact that most people don't start doing things till they're 22, right?
Yeah.
It's 18 years from when you're 22 to 40. 48 is another 8 years. That's not so close to 40. And in fact, so one of the things that's rather amusing, so for the statistical mechanics book I'm writing, each chapter starts with a quote from a paper that's the central paper in some sense related to that chapter. So there's a chapter on the Liang Theorem, and this is the famous paper of Liang. And I happen to note the ages of the authors of the papers that I'm quoting. Every single paper, with one exception, the authors were either 29 or 30. Wow. When they wrote that paper. The one exception was David Thales, who the paper I'm talking about was 40. And that's the paper for which he got the Nobel Prize. But, Li and Yang did this particular piece of work when they were 30. The stuff they got the Nobel Prize, they were 34. And one of the papers is a paper I wrote with Frillick and Spencer. It's clearly one of my most important, if not the most important pieces of work. And I was 30 when that was published. Not written. Publication dates, because we know.
Barry, moving closer to the present, I know that you certainly didn't write this title. This is what editors do to get people to read the articles. The interview that you gave in Nature, the mathematician who helped to reshape physics. Fair title?
Well, I would say mathematical physicist, not mathematician. I object a little bit to being called mathematician. I helped, and it did reshape physics. It's not a terrible title. That was all the idea of the author, by the way, not just the title, the idea of doing the article. It certainly wasn't my suggestion. He first, when Thales got the Nobel Prize, he contacted me and asked some questions. He's an interesting guy.
Is that how you see the trajectory of your career, more as reshaping physics as opposed to reshaping math?
No. This is the one. No. Again, this is discussing one particular piece of work. This is the Berry's phase and my work on the Thales, related to Thales. That work has had a real impact on physics. In the sense, not because the work itself. So it's a strange phenomenon, because the Berry's phase it's a cute piece of work, but it by itself is not so earth-shattering. But it somehow pointed out that there was this topological structure in non-relativistic quantum mechanics. And that has had an enormous impact. So if I felt he was summarizing my career, I'd say it's a lousy summary. But he's not. He's talking about one particular piece of work, and that piece of work, its import, it's an amusing piece of work in general, but its import is not as mathematics. It's really, I mean, among other things, mathematicians, if they know what I did, they'll say that's mathematically trivial. Of course it's true. And it's once you realize it, of course it's true. But it realized, it's one of these discoveries that was somewhat surprising. It made people realize that there was some structure there that has an incredibly important role in condensed matter physics. Both Barry and I have been very fortunate. He probably more fortunate than me.
Yeah. Barry, the research belongs earlier in the narrative, but because of his 100th birthday that's coming up, I wonder if you might share some thoughts about the legacy of Shmuel Agmon.
So Agmon he had a very interesting development on his own. I was recently looking at a video of there was a celebration of the stepping down of an editor of Journal d'Analyse, which is an Israeli-based. It's a math journal. It has a French name, and it's based in Israel. It's an Israeli math journal. So Shmuel was there. It's the last time I saw him. This was 6 months ago. He was already close to 100. And he said various things. It was actually in Feinfeld. I can send you the link and tell, it's 2.5 hours, but I can indicate to you where he speaks up. It's actually quite amusing. So, he wound up, he originally, Israel was a desert in mathematics. And there was some, he did get an education at Hebrew University, but he actually got his PhD in France in complex analysis. And then he fairly quickly became a big expert in partial differential equations. And about 1970, so he was by then close to 50, I guess. Is that correct? Yeah, he was close to 50. He became interested in things connected with Schrödinger operators. 60. Yes. And he made a number of just absolutely spectacular discoveries, 3 in particular, in this non-relativistic quantum mechanics. We had interactions, and he revolutionized a piece of one body quantum scattering, totally fresh ideas, and then a small but interesting subject that I've been interested in, exponential decay, he totally revolutionized, and he was 60. So in fact, he's a counterexample to this over 40 if you're just looking at Schrödinger operators. Still probably true that he also has important work in elliptic partial differential equations, but it may be true, because I actually think his work on Schrödinger operators may be his most important work, and he was over 40 when that was done. I hadn't quite realized how old he must have been when he did the thing that I called the Agmon metric, which is what everyone calls it now. And that must have been about the late 1970s. And if he was born in 1922, he was certainly mid-50s. And a very interesting character. Very charming. Can be somewhat acerbic, somewhat acid every once in a while, but generally really sweet character. And interesting sense of humor. I really like him.
Well, Barry, we've worked literally right up to the present day. For the last part of our talk, for this excellent series of interview sessions, I want to ask some broadly retrospective questions, and then we'll end looking to the future.
Okay.
Simple question right off the bat. In your career in mathematical physics, what stands out in your memory as simply having the most fun?
So really, if I was asked to pick my 3 or 4 biggest discoveries, it's the moment when I realized I had it. Right? When I realized I could prove the continuous symmetry breaking in the classical Heisenberg model, that was just a great feeling. I don't know whether fun is the right word, but it's the closest I can come to.
Satisfaction.
It's certainly most satisfying. I don't know. And the ones, of course, where I'm doing it with someone, it's particularly fun when you bounce ideas around and make some progress. So, work Elliot and I did on Thomas Fermi, we just bounced ideas back and forth. That was lots of fun. It was frustrating at times because we ran into problems, but we eventually solved them.
To flip that around, what have been the most frustrating moments when that satisfaction eluded you no matter what you did?
Well, there are problems that as I think I mentioned earlier, I tended not to return to things. I would give up, but I would give up only after I tried and I couldn't get something to work. So if I look at n-body quantum scattering, which I asymptotic completeness, I knew it was a very hard problem. Didn't spend a lot of time on it, but it isn't that I never thought about it at all, and it was frustrating not to do that. And the other frustrating thing is sometimes dealing with students that you really think can do better than they. That seems to be stopped.
A counterfactual question that's impossible to answer, but I'll ask anyway. You alluded to it earlier. Had you stayed at Princeton, would your career have been more or less the same or different than what it became when you came to Caltech?
My guess is my research has been narrower than it would have been if I'd stayed at Princeton.
Simply because the community is narrower.
Well, it's not narrower. If you look at what I'm doing,
yeah,
right? I didn't have lots of people to talk with, so I sort of almost had to. It was a much smaller group of people, and so I focused on a much more limited set of things. And by the way, if I stayed at Princeton, I'm willing to make you a wager I would have been elected to the National Academy 20 years earlier.
That's a statement of Princeton's pull in math, particularly?
Well, the fact that somehow, and if I'd moved to Courant, I would have been in 30 years earlier. Courant somehow really works high. I don't know why, but it always manages to get its people early into the academy. So.
Is mathematical physics as a scholarly community stronger, weaker, or about the same going back to the Arthur Whiteman days?
So depending on how you define mathematical physics, we have some good young people, but not as many as there were 50 years ago. There was this golden era that I've alluded to at Princeton in the 70s. And one of the reasons it's golden, it had this really very impressive group of young people. My impression is they're not so much going into mathematical physics anymore. There are a few. There are some very impressive young people, no question about it. But not as many.
I'll narrow the question to Caltech. I know not mathematical physics, but just math in general. Is math stronger than it was when you joined? Have you been a positive influence in strengthening math at Caltech?
Oh, there's no question Caltech is much stronger than it went. Caltech, before I came, it's orders of magnitude better now. Now, if you ask, is it better now than it was in 2000? That's a hard question to ask. We had this amazing influx in 2000 of young people who are really good, and then you lost them all. We have some very good young people now, so it's harder to tell, but ask me in 10 years.
In 10 years, do you think we'll see a mathematician as division chair of PMA?
No.
What does that tell us?
That will continue to be second-class citizens.
Yeah.
There's no, I hope to improve mathematics by positioning, in essence, by separating it off, but I failed in that. No, there's no, we'll continue to be second-class citizens.
Now, obviously, it's an imperfect comparison because we have the divisions and not the departments here, but the notion of second-class citizenship, does that translate to Caltech's peer institutes? Would you see that at Harvard or Stanford, MIT, Princeton, Chicago, or is that really unique?
Depends on the institution.
Yeah.
Depends on the institution. No question, if you look at Princeton, math has always, in some sense, not that physics isn't well thought of, but math has always had a special place in Princeton. Chicago, that's also true. So no, if you look at the big six, what I think of as the big six institutions, they've always been the top six during my professional career: Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, Chicago, Stanford.
MIT?
MIT. They all have math departments are not second-class citizens in any way, shape, or form.
This is a legacy of Millikan's that might never go away.
Well, it's both a legacy of Millikan and it's a legacy of history, right? My guess is that math had more faculty slots at Princeton than physics, and that's always been true. Physics was 3 times as big as mathematics. It's hard to change that dramatically unless, a subject like mathematics. And given Caltech's attitude that if it grows in areas that bring in lots of money, and that mathematics by its nature is not going to be a big money maker, you bring in lots of money, it's not going to change the health.
Barry, your work strictly outside the research, the specialty realm. Your work in computers, your work in education. Where have you derived the most satisfaction in working toward the greater societal good?
I don't know. So the computer stuff has been entirely a question of fun. I don't think I can claim I made huge contributions to society, although, it is true I improved the math software by being an intelligent critic. But I don't think of that as, I've never been someone who worries about societal good. Even my science. Science has been contributed incredible amounts to society, but it's always by people focusing on doing science, not on focusing on, I want to help society. Not always, but certainly on the more theoretical side. In mathematics, it's always just doing the good mathematics because it's beautiful and you get satisfaction. And by golly, turns out to have an enormous impact on the world.
Yeah. But in ways that you can't foresee and are not motivated by.
And that not only can't you foresee and you aren't motivated, but if you tried to do it that way, you wouldn't do as good in mathematics.
Barry, looking to the future, a few questions. Quantum computation. Do you have a good idea, or at least can you let your imagination run wild, how that might change mathematical physics in a way that classical computing cannot?
Well, I, of course, have friends who believe quantum computing is nonsense.
Right.
I have a co-author who's one of the most famous critics of quantum computing. But there are those who believe that quantum computers will be able to do something like model an atom or model, in which case it could be an amazing experimental tool in suggesting what theorems might be true. So I could imagine it having an impact. But not very likely, but possible.
What are some of the big mysteries, puzzles, whatever you want to call them, both in mathematics and physics, for which the sensibilities and background and training in mathematical physics might be the most fertile area where the person might be coming from to contribute to these breakthroughs?
I'm going to pass on that question. That's above my pay. I just don't think about that kind of question.
Like if there's a breakthrough in quantum gravity or a 400-year-old theorem or something like that, does a mathematical physicist have a special toolbox that might not be available to someone more narrowly defined in their research?
No. Generally, my impression is that people who make the most progress are ones that somehow have a broad background, a broad knowledge base on which to call to pick out the right tools.
That sounds like having the dual research expertise is theoretically of value.
Oh, certainly. No, you want to have expertise, but is it mathematical physics or, the right blend of probability and combinatorics and a little topology on the side? I don't know.
Finally, Barry, for you, I know you have however many more pages in the book, 300 or 400 pages. Beyond that, what else do you want to accomplish?
I don't know, have some great-grandchildren to bounce on my knees. I actually have a plan after this book to do the second edition. I sort of expected it would be 10 years. It's been now 15 years since I wrote the OPUC, and it stimulated an enormous amount of work. And I actually have a contract for AMS to do a second edition. It's on the list, but I'm an old guy. I'm allowed to rest on my laurels to some extent.
Barry, I want to thank you for spending all this time with me. These sessions have been an incredible amount of fun, a great treasure for the historical record. I'm so glad we were able to do this. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.